Emma Parker, a young woman in her early 20s, sat in her usual spot at Central Square, Boston, her acoustic guitar resting against her knees. The chilly autumn air nipped at her fingers as she began to strum the familiar chords of a song she had played countless times. Her music floated through the square, weaving between the hurried footsteps of office workers, the laughter of children, and the hum of street vendors. To many, it was just another melody adding character to the bustling heart of the city. But for Emma, it was much more. It was her connection to the past, to the mother she had lost, and the family she was determined to protect. Emma's grandfather, Thomas Parker, had been her sole guardian since she was a child, a retired mechanic. He had always provided for her, but age and illness had taken their toll. Now, as his health declined, Emma had taken on the role of caregiver, juggling odd jobs and her passion for music to make ends meet. Playing the guitar on the streets was not glamorous, but it was honest work. More importantly, it was her mother's legacy. Lila Parker had been a talented pianist, and though Emma had never inherited her skill with the keys, she had found her voice in the strings. Every note she played felt like a conversation with her mother, a way to keep her memory alive. That day, Emma had chosen a particularly poignant piece, one that seemed to echo the emotions swirling inside her. As she played, her eyes drifted over the crowd, observing the faces of those who stopped to listen. Some smiled, some dropped $1 or $2 into her open guitar case, and some simply walked by, lost in their own worlds. But one face stood out, a man, older, perhaps in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored coat that suggested wealth. He stood at the edge of the square, watching her intently. His expression was hard to read, a mixture of nostalgia and something deeper, almost like pain. Emma felt a flicker of unease under his gaze, but she continued playing, letting the music speak for her. The man did not move. His eyes locked on her as though she were the only person in the square. When she finished the song, the applause of a few onlookers brought her back to the present. She looked up, and the man was still there, his eyes glistening with unspoken words. Gathering her courage, Emma addressed him. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative but polite. "Did you like the music?" The man hesitated, his voice trembling slightly when he finally spoke. "It was beautiful," he said, "but more than that, it felt familiar." Emma tilted her head, unsure how to respond. "Familiar," she echoed. "How so?" He took a step closer, his hands fumbling in his coat pockets. "May I ask about your bracelet?" he said, his gaze dropping to the silver band on her wrist. Emma instinctively touched the bracelet, a delicate piece with intricate engravings. It had been her mother's, a cherished heirloom passed down with love and stories. "This," she said, "it was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed away." The man's breath hitched, and for a moment, he seemed to struggle for words. "Your mother, what was her name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's brow furrowed, suspicion creeping into her mind. "Her name was Lila," she said. "Lila Parker." At the mention of the name, the man's face paled. He took another step closer, his hands trembling. "Lila," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "She was a pianist, wasn't she?" Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Yes," she said cautiously. "How do you know that?" The man seemed to crumble before her, his shoulders sagging as he knelt down to meet her gaze. "I knew her," he said, his voice breaking. She was someone very special to me." Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Special?" she asked, her voice growing firmer. "Who are you? And what do you know about my mother?" The man looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and regret. "My name is Robert Carter," he said. "And your mother, Lila, she was my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. "Your daughter?" she repeated, disbelief evident in her tone. "That can't be true. My grandfather never mentioned you." Robert lowered his head, shame evident in his posture. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "Terrible mistakes. I lost contact with Lila years ago, and not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted it. When I saw you, heard your music, it was like seeing her again. And that bracelet, his voice caught, and he swallowed hard. That bracelet was a gift I gave her when she was young. Emma stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and a glimmer of hope. Could this man truly be connected to her mother? And if so, why had he been absent from their lives? I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. If you really are who you say you are, why did my mother never talk about you? Why weren't you there for her? Robert's face crumpled with guilt. I don't have an excuse, he said. All I can say is that I want to make things right. Please, Emma, give me a chance to explain. Emma stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. Her mind screamed at her to walk away, to protect herself from the pain of false hope. But her heart, the same heart that had guided her fingers on the guitar strings, told her to stay, to listen. She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting Robert's. Okay, she said finally, you have a lot to explain. As the bustling square continued its frenetic pace around them, Emma and Robert stood together, two strangers bound by a shared past they were only beginning to uncover. The melody that had brought them together now seemed to weave a new story, one filled with questions, revelations, and the possibility of redemption. Emma didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope, a hope that the music she played might be the key to healing wounds she hadn't even known existed. Emma Parker sat across from Robert Carter in a quiet corner of Maple Leaf Cafe. The bustling sounds of Boston seemed muted here, as though the world had momentarily paused to make room for the weight of the conversation they were about to have. Emma's hands rested on the table, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edges of her coffee cup. Robert sat opposite her, his posture tense, his eyes fixed on the bracelet that seemed to connect them across a chasm of years and unanswered questions. Start from the beginning, Emma said, her voice steady but tinged with wariness. If you knew my mother, if you really were her father, I need to know everything. No vague answers, no half-truths. Robert nodded, his face solemn. I understand. You deserve the truth. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Lila was my only child. She was everything to me, bright, talented, full of life. She had a gift for music that amazed everyone who heard her. I always believed she would do great things. Emma listened intently, her emotions oscillating between curiosity and guarded skepticism. She had grown up hearing only fragments about her mother's past, most of them from her grandfather Thomas, who had painted a picture of a loving but complicated woman. There had never been any mention of Robert, and the absence now felt glaring. What happened? Emma pressed. Why weren't you there when she needed you? Why wasn't I raised knowing about you? Robert winced at the bluntness of her questions, but didn't shy away. I made mistakes, he admitted, his voice thick with regret. When Lila was young, I was focused on my career, on building a life that I thought would provide for both of us. But I let my ambition blind me to what really mattered. We had a falling out when she was in her early 20s. She wanted to pursue music. But he paused, his voice breaking. I thought it was impractical, a waste of her potential. We argued, and in my stubbornness, I pushed her away. She left, and I didn't follow. Emma's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, but anger simmered beneath her sympathy. So you just let her go? She asked, her tone sharp. You didn't even try to make amends? Robert shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I wanted to. Emma, God, I wanted to, but I was too proud, too ashamed. By the time I tried to reach out, she had vanished. I hired people to find her, but it was as though she had disappeared entirely. Years went by, and not a day passed that I didn't think of her. Wonder where she was, if she was happy, if she had a family of her own. Emma bit her lip, her mind swirling with questions. And what about now? She asked. How did you find me? Robert gave a sad smile. Pure chance, he said. I was passing through Central Square when I heard you playing. Your music, it stopped me in my tracks. It was so much like Lila's. Then I saw the bracelet, and I knew. I didn't know how to approach you, but I couldn't walk away again. Not this time. Emma studied him, searching his face for signs of deceit. But all she saw was a man weighed down by years of guilt and longing. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of her childhood made trust difficult. "What about my grandfather?" she asked. "Thomas Parker. He never mentioned you. Not once. If you were so important to my mother, why would he keep you a secret?" Robert's expression darkened. "Thomas and we didn't part on good terms," he admitted. "He blamed me for Lila's departure. And he was right too. When she left, I tried to reach out to him, but he wanted nothing to do with me. He was protective of her. And when she had you, I imagine he felt it was his duty to shield you from my failures." Emma's chest tightened at the thought of her grandfather, the man who had raised her with so much love and sacrifice. "He's sick now," she said softly. "He doesn't talk much about the past, and I never pressed him. Maybe I should have." Robert reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Emma," he said, his voice earnest. "I know I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I want to be here for you now. If you'll let me, I'll prove that I mean it." Emma pulled her hand away, her mind a storm of emotions. "This is too much," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know if I believe you." Robert nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "I don't blame you," he said, "but I have proof. I kept everything, letters, photographs, records. If you're willing, I can show you." Emma hesitated, the weight of his offer pressing down on her. She had spent her life wondering about the gaps in her family's history. And now, here was a chance to fill them, but the risk of opening old wounds was daunting. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Show me." Robert's relief was palpable. "Thank you," he said. "I promise I won't let you down." As they left the cafe, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The man walking beside her was a stranger, but his words had stirred something deep within her, a longing for answers, for connection, for the pieces of her story that had been missing for so long. Whether or not she would find the truth, Emma knew one thing for certain. She was no longer walking this path alone. The sun was beginning to set as Emma followed Robert to his home, a stately brownstone in Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood. She couldn't help but feel out of place among the elegant row houses and cobblestone streets. The warmth of the evening couldn't chase away the chill of uncertainty gnawing at her. Robert unlocked the door and stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. This was Lila's home too. "For a time," he said, his voice soft with nostalgia. "I kept it just the way it was when she left." Emma stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the grand piano in the corner of the living room. The polished wood gleamed in the fading light, and the sight of it made her chest tighten. Her mother had sat at a piano like this once, her fingers dancing across the keys, filling the room with melodies Emma had never heard but could somehow feel. Robert gestured for her to sit as he pulled out a weathered box from a nearby shelf. "This is everything I have left of her," he said, placing it gently on the coffee table between them. He opened the lid, revealing an assortment of photographs, letters, and small trinkets. Emma hesitated before picking up a photograph of a young woman with Robert's eyes and her own shy smile. She recognized the face immediately. It was her mother. "She was beautiful," Emma murmured, her fingers brushing against the image. Robert nodded, his expression bittersweet. She had a spirit that could light up a room. "Losing her was the greatest regret of my life." Emma sifted through the contents of the box, finding letters in her mother's handwriting. They were addressed to Robert, but had never been sent. "Why didn't she send these?" Emma asked, her voice cracking. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "Maybe she thought it was too late. Or maybe she didn't believe I would listen." Among the papers was a birth certificate, Emma's. Her hands trembled as she read her name and her mother's. And beneath them, the name of her father was left blank. "Why didn't she tell me about you?" Emma asked, her voice thick with emotion. Robert leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I think she wanted to protect you," he said, "from my mistakes, from the pain of knowing I wasn't there when she needed me. But I want to change that now. Emma, I want to be the family you deserve." Emma closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing against her heart. Could she forgive him? Could she trust that this man, a stranger who claimed to love her mother. Truly wanted to make amends? I need time, she said finally. This is a lot to process. Robert nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Emma, I promise. Weeks turned into months as Emma and Robert began to rebuild the bridges of their fractured family. Robert was patient, never pushing her to move faster than she was ready. He visited her often at Central Square, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd as she played her guitar. Slowly, Emma began to let him in, sharing stories of her childhood, her struggles, and her dreams. Thomas Parker, her beloved grandfather, was initially wary of Robert, but when Robert showed him the letters and photographs, Thomas softened. She always spoke highly of you, Thomas admitted one evening, even when she didn't think you'd ever hear it. Robert's presence became a source of strength for Emma, especially as she prepared for the biggest moment of her life, a performance at the prestigious Boston Symphony Hall. With her newfound family cheering her on, Emma took the stage, her guitar in hand and her heart full of hope. The theater was silent as her fingers began to pluck the strings, the melody flowing like a river of emotion. Each note carried the weight of her journey, the pain of loss, the joy of reunion, and the promise of a future filled with love and music. As she played, she spotted Robert and Thomas in the front row, their faces glowing with pride. For the first time, Emma felt whole, as though the scattered pieces of her life had finally come together. When the last note faded into the air, the audience erupted into applause. Emma stood, her eyes brimming with tears as she bowed deeply. She had played not just for the crowd, but for herself, her mother, and the family she had found against all odds. Backstage, Robert embraced her tightly, his voice trembling with emotion. Your mother would be so proud of you. Emma, Thomas added, his voice thick with tears. And so am I, my dear. You've brought us all back together. Emma smiled, her heart full. She knew her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. With her guitar in hand and her family by her side, Emma Parker knew that her melodies would continue to touch hearts, weaving a story of love, loss, and redemption that would resonate far beyond the walls of any theater. The world was her stage now, and her music, her mother's legacy, would carry her forward.